Great. Shall we kick things off?
Yes.
Let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to be hosting this panel where we're going to be discussing generative AI and its impact on the music industry. We're going to cover opportunities and the risks, highlight issues and industry imperatives, and also suggest ways which others in the music industry can contribute. So before we start the conversation, I would love if everyone could go around and give a couple of lines to introduce themselves, your name, what you do, and why you're here. Chris, we can start with you.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Chris Horton. I'm SVP of Strategic Technology at Universal Music Group, and I report into Michael Nash, who's Chief Digital Officer and a very fine gentleman. And I have a computer science background. I studied AI back when it was symbolic many years ago. So I'm happy to be sucked in again as it comes back around and is neural network based these days. So I've been paying attention to what's been going on in the space for the last few years and have been kind of beating the drum internally.
Wonderful. Claire?
Hi, my name is Claire Evans. I'm a sometime tech journalist and writer, and also 1/3 of a band called YACHT, which stands for Young Americans Challenging High Technology, a very appropriate acronym, I think, for this conversation. Back in 2017, 2018, we decided to make an album in collaboration with AI, soup to nuts, using machine learning to generate notes, lyrics, and even things like band portraits, videos, album artwork. A process that took a lot longer to ideate and execute than we anticipated and involved a lot more human intervention. So I'm excited to talk about how AI has changed since then and what it meant to us creatively.
And last but certainly not least, Shannon.
Thanks. I'm Shannon Sorensen. I am SVP of Legal and Business Affairs at the National Music Publishers Association, which is a trade association representing most of the music publishers in the US. I come from a policy background. I was on the Hill previous to this and then helped to work to pass the Music Modernization Act. And now I do both policy and legal enforcement and licensing work. So AI is the big topic in both of those policy and legal worlds right now. So happy to be here.
Nice. And a little bit about myself. I will be your moderator for today. My name is Dani Deahl. I'm a DJ, producer, the president of the Chicago chapter of the Recording Academy, and also head of communications and creator insights at BandLab, which is a free-to-use online cross-platform DAW, which also has an AI component called Song Starter, which artists can use to kickstart ideas so they don't have to look at a blank canvas, which I know all too well. Claire, I'm sure you do too.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking about the creation portion, getting right into it, AI obviously presents a massive opportunity for artists as an empowerment tool. But I think that a lot of people don't actually understand the differences between different applications of AI. And specifically for this panel, we're talking about generative AI. So would someone be so kind as to explain the differences and what it is we're exactly going to be focusing on today? I'm going to pick on somebody. Chris?
You're gonna pick on me? Okay. So I think AI generally, we can think of it as using machines to do things with we'll do hand wavy intelligence. And in the music industry, we use that for all kinds of different things. That could be doing analysis of sales data to try and pick out trends. It could be source separation, where you want to pull out a particular stem from a track because you don't have the multi-tracks. It could be listening to music and generating metadata. And generative AI in this context is AI that makes music, makes images, makes text. And there's a bunch of different varieties, but I think for these purposes, hopefully that's enough detail.
And how established would you say these tools currently are? Have they been around for a while? Are people using them and they don't even know it? Or is this brand spanking new technology?
It's been around for a long while. Claire is particularly qualified to talk about this because she was involved in a documentary that dug way deep into the history of this. I don't know if you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, we can go way back. I mean, generative composition processes even predate computer science. People have been using aleatoric processes to make music. There's nothing new about that fundamentally. I think the tools for doing it at scale and drawing on massive data sets are relatively recent, and consumer-facing tools are only very, very recent. When I first started working with this technology, it was mostly in the research space using open source models, kind of having to enlist the help of friends who can code. Whereas now pretty much anybody can, if they want to, start dabbling right away and make things.
I would love to hear a little bit more about the process that you use, Claire, in collaborating with AI for the album that you did a few years ago. What was the involvement on the AI's end, and what was the collaboration process like, and did it make you create differently afterwards?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, I think for me, especially at that time, I think less so now, but I think AI represents this really interesting opportunity to be actually reflective, because machine learning models are trained on these historic data sets. If we're in a position to examine those data sets, to understand what's going into them, to have control over what's going into them, then they can really bring us into active conversation with, the entire history of music, with our influences, and also with the nuances of our own specific previous output. So in my experience working with AI tools, that's what we did. We worked from our own past. We extrapolated and interpolated and generated from our own past, inputting pairs of melodies in the form of short MIDI clips into a model called a latent space interpolation model, which I'm not going to get into the weeds on, but essentially is a way of exploring a kind of high dimensional mathematical space of possibility between existing melodies, AKA traveling the untraveled paths of your own musical history. Finding these songs, picking these songs out from a parallel timeline of your own past. From those interpolations, we were able to pick and choose what we like now, and then assign these fragments of melodies into larger structures to different instruments, and then performing and recording them live. So embodying them, kind of wrestling with them, making them our own. And then I think in a process like this, AI is basically like a complex, interesting mirror, like a way of seeing ourselves in a new way, mixing up an existing process, mixing up an existing creative workflow, and then challenging ourselves to create meaning. So it's totally changed the way I think about making music. It totally changed my approach to making music. And I don't think I'll ever do it again, because it was really hard.
Was it hard?
Yeah, it's just incredibly tedious and unfun. Again, I think because we were working at a time before these tools were very consumer facing. So we were really like under the hood, coming up against the difficulties of actually coding and stuff. But again, we had a lot more control because of that. We were able to have really granular levels of control over both the input and the output, which allowed us to think about AI in this kind of reflective way. Whereas now I think the tools that are available to consumers don't allow you to really look under the hood in that same way. And I think it's because consumers don't really want that. They want the magic of just describing something and getting that instant feedback. They want it to be easy, but unfortunately, art is hard. What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? As someone who's worked with AI a lot over the years, is there something that currently doesn't exist that you wish did?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, like the tools that we use don't exist anymore because they got sublimated into other things. But I would love like an easy to control consumer facing version of what we had sort of cobbled together using what was available at the time. I would love a way to travel my own history and look at my own patterns and try to understand who I am as an artist and tweak and change parameters. I think it's really important to be working at like a symbolic level and not necessarily the level of generating sounds, a way to generate prompts, MIDI-based prompts that you can then choose how to actually perform and what to perform on. I think that level of like production choice is really key. It's not so fun to just press a button and get a song. It's more fun to press a button and get a fun challenge that you then get to try to turn into a song.
Going off of that, though, we do have AIs that serve both functions at this point. We have push button AIs, and then we also have AIs that give you that first step in the process, right? We have an array of tools that are available to musicians. And with the proliferation of these tools, are there certain roles in music that have diminished or are at risk of being diminished because the technology is advancing so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dominate the early conversation, but yeah, there's obviously a distinction to be drawn between functional and expressive music. Like There's music that's for relaxation and jogging and elevators and background use. And I know a lot of musicians who have side hustles making that kind of music, myself included. And I can totally see generative AI tools doing away with that income stream, as it will most likely, I think, also for music produced for commercials. Anecdotally, like the kinds of prompts that you see that are given as like sample prompts for example, like Google's new music generating tool, Music LM, with these prompts that are like a fusion of reggaeton and electronic music that sounds spacey and otherworldly. That's pretty much exactly the same language that like music supervisors use on commercial briefs. So like that feels quite vividly like that's an income stream that will go away. At the same time, I hope, and I hope that the rest of you can speak to this, that these technologies present an opportunity for new forms of income streams, like possibly some form of licensing or micropayment for participating in a data set. I'm not sure that all evens out in the long term, but I would like to see that put in place ASAP.
I'd love to hear thoughts from the rest of you on this topic.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think obviously there's always going to be a market for human created music. We love to connect with our artists. We love to know that they're real people, especially with the proliferation of social media. We get these parasocial relationships with people, and we feel like we know them. And I think that connection is only going to get bigger, and it's only gotten bigger with the rise of social media. So I don't think human artists are going away anytime soon. Aside from the social aspect, I think human created art is going to bring depth and emotion that maybe AI art is not going to be able to. So I think there's always going to be a market for that. At the same time, I think what Claire said is right, that in the production music space, you might see more AI cropping up. And I think I could see that being really prevalent in areas where the industry has some gaps in licensing, like micro sync space, where you don't have a way to get licenses very easily for commercial uses on social media or for podcast jingles and things like that. I can see that cropping up to fill some of those gaps or being easier to license there.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, we see that there is enormous opportunity with AI, and that we're not anti-AI at all. We see that if it develops with the artist at the center of the vision, then we go down one path where there's going to be these empowerment tools that artists are going to be able to use to get rid of some of the drudgery. If you need to harmonize something or go back through your MIDI and change each, no, you're down a key, you want to move like it could handle that for you. But if we go down the other path where artists are not really considered at all, then we can see maybe the smaller undiscovered artists have a harder time because there's more AI generated noise out in the marketplace, or that algorithm-based recommendation engines start recommending more AI content because it costs the service less than the human-generated content, and that people like Brian Eno or Max Richter, who have sleep music or focus music, they start to be impacted by AI-generated content. And then we're already today seeing sound-alikes made using AI that are supposed to sound like our artists, but weren't actually created by them at all.
Chris, you just opened up a whole Pandora's box of potential scenarios that could be problematic. So let's dig into that a little bit more. What are some of the ways, you certainly touched on a couple right now, what are some of the ways that AI could potentially impact the music industry and change existing business models?
Yeah, I think so that list is kind of the way that we think about these are the possible negative impacts. Some of, as I mentioned, we're already seeing, like we're starting to see these deep fakes pop up. I don't think that long term, as Shannon and Claire said, the role of the artist is to create culture, and fans want to have that human interaction, and they relate to the reason why Taylor Swift is so popular is not, it's because of her as a human. And so we're not going to see AIs replace that. You can't go to a meet and greet with an AI, at least, maybe after we have AGI, we can have this conversation again. But so that the core value of the human artist is not going to go away. But if the AI is developed without that human the artist rights at the center of the thinking, then we'll start to see some of these other things develop. And, it's a little hard to predict, but, getting lost in the noise or starting to be eroded from places where having a named artist is not as important is something that we're likely to see.
I also think that like human artists do have the capacity to like adapt themselves to platforms in a negative way, right? Because like we already look at the way that streaming platforms like Spotify and even TikTok have changed the way that music is written. Pop song structure has changed, choruses hit sooner, songs are shorter, the playlist is king, and like albums are dead allegedly. At the same time, music is really expensive. It costs Spotify a lot of money every time somebody wants to listen to Taylor Swift. So it feels like somewhat frighteningly inevitable to me that the sort of final boss of those two factors, like our willingness or necessity to adapt ourselves to the platforms in order to be economically visible, and the platform's desires to cut costs, will be that generative AI will be used to produce like kind of plausible sounding background music that can be slipped into playlists to maximize a bottom line. I think that's short-sighted because a few generated tracks might slip in unnoticed, but if there's too many, there's no longer any there. There's no longer that social element. There's nothing drawing people to these platforms at all. And long term, I think it devalues music as a whole.
What are some of the benefits that can come from AI? I'm so sorry, Shannon, were you about to say something?
I was just going to add really quickly that TikTok acquired a company that does generative music called Juke Deck a couple of years ago. And similarly, their parent company, which runs a streaming service in China, they also have ByteDance. They have generative AI technologies, and they're putting AI music on their platform. And so something I think to think about that might be a possible change in the market that we're seeing is that, as Chris alluded to earlier with the algorithmic preferences, what we might start to see and what we don't want to see is companies owning music or filling their platforms with music that they own or that they control that was generated by AI that's cheaper or free to them, and having that replace human creators. Now, I think there's still a huge market for trending music on TikTok. I think obviously a lot of human artists get traction and connect with their fans there and have the, you can go viral and have a song become big on TikTok, and that's where a lot of music discovery happens. I think that's still going to be very present, but the question of like, for filling the catalog and people who are getting paid for those syncs all the time, if companies are directing or promoting more of that AI creative music, we could see the licensing revenue go down a lot for human creators, and we don't want to see that.
Absolutely. On the flip side, what are some of the bonuses that can come with greater adoption in generative AI?
One of the things that's interesting to me is thinking about how artists might be able to use the AI to explore different spaces. So you write a song and you're like, I wonder what this would sound like if it was in a minor key, or I wonder what if we replaced the guitar with the violin, or what if we, and to go back and re-record, and that's a lot of work. So what if you could just tell the AI, hey, can you do that quickly? Actually, that sounds pretty good. Let's go back into the studio and re-record it, right? So it could be that kind of thing. Maybe if you don't speak Chinese, but you want to have a Chinese language version of your song, and you're okay with it, and it's trained on your voice and you're totally approved, maybe you now sing in Chinese, it's Mandarin. It could be something that this type of thing enables, but I defer to you and Claire, who are much closer to this than I am.
I mean, I think we haven't yet seen what music will look like. It will change the face of music, and people will find interesting and subversive ways to use these tools that create new forms. I mean, I think that's so core to what artists are and what artists do. Artists have been threatened by new technologies since the invention of recorded music. And if you look at the history, the most effective way to combat that displacement or exploitation is to find a way to take the ostensibly threatening technology and make it an essential part of your practice, to make yourself indispensable. I talk a lot about like the synthesizer and the drum machine, but I think it's a really good example because these are technologies that were invented ostensibly to displace session musicians, to make demo recordings cheaper. There's a lot of pushback against it at the time, as there is against generative AI now. But what happened is that musicians took up the mantle of that challenge, and they used those tools to create entirely new forms of music, of which they were like the masters of, and that nobody could take away from them. And that's what artists do. That's how we get new cultural forms. Otherwise, we'd just be stuck in a loop forever. So I think we do need to create space for that to happen. We don't want to be so reactionary that we push away from the possibility that actually creative adaptation, it will be the thing that makes us the most resilient to change.
Can I kind of pile on to that? Like if you think about the role of technology and content, it goes hand in hand. There's this false presumption that we're anti-tech as an industry, but if you think about radio and TV and what we do on our phones and what we do with game consoles, all of that is content driven. The technology requires that content to exist, and the creators depend on that technology for their content to be available to the masses. So it's not really that we're anti-technology in any sense. We've been closely tied for decades.
Totally. New technologies means new forms of content. The invention of the radio gave us the radio, AM radio songs. It's like, that's just the way it is. I don't quite know what it looks like yet next, but I'm excited to discover what it is.
Yeah. Just to reiterate, I completely agree with what the two of you are saying. Essentially, new advances in technology have always driven new forms of art. And very specifically, the way music has been made, delivered, distributed, and consumed has always been dictated by new forms of technology. And it's never erased music, and it's never erased the musician. It's, to Claire's word, made us more resilient, adaptable, and has actually inspired entire genres of new music that would have never existed before. So on that note, let's go into a little bit of a side conversation. We're talking a lot about what it's like for the artist to use AI, but what happens when AI developers use content from musicians? So Claire, how would you feel about AI developers using your work to train a commercial AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's a non-starter, obviously. I think it's tricky because all great artists steal, right? We go into a studio and we want to make a song that sounds like Devo or sounds like The Fall. We have influences that we're always trying to channel. The difference is that when we do that, we fail. Like, we come up against our own limitations, and what comes out is something completely new, something completely different. Like, there's the input, which is the influence, there's the output, which is the new song, and in between there's this big messy black box of a system called a human being that just scrambles it all up and transforms it and is transformed in the process. The problem with commercial generative tools is that there is no intermediary. It's just prompt, being, output. Nothing is transformed, nothing is learned, nothing happens, no one is changed. The only thing that is transformed is that data turns into money. And even though the artists are providing that data, albeit most of the time unwittingly, they don't see a dime of that money. So I think just fundamentally, that ain't it. That doesn't work. I think a lot of these commercial platforms have found a way to kind of commercialize these tools by sort of ambiguously scraping data from the internet and kind of like data washing it through academic and research institutions, but that can't stand long term. There needs to be some kind of model to either opt out or conscientiously opt in with compensation.
Are there any protections that currently exist to meet these problems?
I mean, I think current copyright law has plenty to address new technologies. The same as every new technology comes out and we find, how the copyright law applies to them. I think, obviously, we have protections against unauthorized reproductions and unauthorized derivative works, and the right to create reproductions and derivative works and the right to authorize them, that rests solely with the copyright owner and the creator. It's not, that doesn't go away when we see a new technology, And so to the extent that AI developers are using music, they have to get permission, the same as any other use. You have to get permission from the owner, and from where I'm sitting, that looks like licensing. So rather than, it's not even necessarily an opt-out system, it's an opting in. Do they have your permission affirmatively to use it? Otherwise, I think there's very strong cases to be made that is presumptively, infringing, and it will come down to what the courts say as far as, how fair use applies. On the ingestion side, I really think on the output side, if you're making a work that sounds just like someone else's work and it was trained on it, the same way that we have, human derivative work cases like the Led Zeppelin case or the Marvin Gaye blurred lines case, it won't matter whether it's an AI or a human doing the infringing. What matters is if you're making a work that's pulling on someone else's work, that's infringement. So I think on the output side, current copyright law addresses that really well. And on the ingestion side, I think it does too, but there will probably be more legal questions figuring out exactly the limits of that.
It sounds like there really only is concrete protection if the output of an AI sounds so close to an existing copyrighted work that an artist is able to say, hey, this sounds like it could have been done by me, but it wasn't. Aside from things that sound so close to works that already exist in the world, apologies, Kat, how might an artist even know that an AI was trained using their work? How would they even begin to get compensation? How would they even think about protecting their intellectual assets?
Yeah, I think maybe to address the way that you framed it, I'm not sure that we agree like the only strong protection is checking the output. I think I would agree with what Shannon said, which is that copyright law already lays out some rules around can you copy, and without, I'm not an attorney, but there's this fair use defense that some of the companies are trying to claim, and we don't see that's applicable here. There's especially if you're trying to use something that was like in the case of Lion 5B, I think it says don't use it for commercial purposes. Well, all of these AIs are charging to use their services, so they're clearly commercial. But going back to your question about how would you even know, there are some interesting avenues of research going on there. There's a couple different techniques that you could use to determine is a particular work was that particular work used to train an AI? So there's something called model inversion where you're trying to get the training set out. And then there's membership inference where you're trying to find whether a particular work was in the training set. And then Dr. Benzow, who's on an earlier panel, talked about his new program called Glaze, which uses some interesting kind of invisible watermark modification of an image so that when you say, make it in the style of that artist who watermarked their images, you kind of get garbage out. So it's confusing the AI. So there's a bunch of different things. One of the other policy questions that we're all talking about is what should the obligations be around keeping records for what your training material and what your input material are. And that would help here as well.
Shannon, I'm wondering, are you aware of any cases that are currently going on that are testing the limits of the unknown when it comes to generative AI in music?
I don't know of any cases directly on point for music AI, but there are a lot of cases, or not a lot, a small handful of cases on the image generator side. There have been, I think, 3 cases filed against Stability AI, or Stability, I think it's called Stability AI. It's an image diffusion model that pulls on a lot of, for example, Getty image material and images. And they have sued Stability AI in California and in the UK. And they're saying, this is unfair copying and you can't scrape all of our material without permission. And also you're removing all of our copyright management information, which is just all the data that's attached to a certain file to identify the copyright owner. And obviously Stability AI, they're going to take the position that it's fair use. And I think, these are just the first in what's probably going to be a really long line of cases about this, but these are kind of setting the roadmap. So they're not directly applicable. I mean, they're not directly on music, but the question of infringement and fair use in ingestion and incidental copies being made in ingestion and subsequently creating generative works and whether those are derivative, these are going to be the exact same questions that we're going to have to answer in music cases.
Are there any decisions that have already been made that we can look to as a peek into the future?
I don't think we're at that point yet, but hopefully over the next year or so, we start to get some of the cases will have some resolution. I mean, realistically, it will take 2 to 3 years before we're getting actual decisions out.
And how should the music industry be thinking about the use of image or text AIs? What are the parallels here, or how do they directly dovetail into music?
Yeah, at least the way that we're thinking about it is, if you want your, here we are talking to the community saying, you need to respect our rights. Don't train your AI on our content without seeking permission first. So we can't very well turn and then use an AI that was trained on someone else's copyrighted content that wasn't licensed and feel good about it. So we think as a creative industry, we need to stick together, whether it's music or photos or text or whatever. We're all in this boat together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is a great deal of value in these tools for like internal iteration in the creative process. For example, we want to design an album cover. We haven't reached out to the illustrator yet, but we're just trying out a few ideas for what we think of what we want it to look like. But we're going to take that process, we're going to maybe iterate using some of these tools, but then we're going to go to the illustrator and hire them and say, what do you think? Is this an interesting jumping off point for you? If it looks like this, does that resonate for you? Or you could use it as part of a mood board or a storyboard for a music video. It can be a really effective way to communicate, big ideas to potential sources of funding or, potential collaborators. I see it as something that's part of a tool set, but I'm not super interested in ever really using the output of any of these models as presenting it as though it were my own art. I see it as part of a process, potentially, not always, but sometimes it can be useful, or potentially as a jumping off point creatively for me. Like, I'm stuck on song lyrics, I'm going to riff and iterate a little bit with a text generating model, and maybe I'm not going to use anything, probably won't, but I might like react against something and that'll spark me and unstick me creatively. Again, part of a process, and certainly not the end of a process. I think the mantra for me is always the output is not the end. It should never be the end.
Yeah, it's interesting to contextualize it in terms of, obviously there is visual output and we use text generally in a lot of music. So these forms are still a part of a musician's process, even though it's not musical per se. And I have a lot of friends personally who are using OpenAI, for example, to generate lyrics for them without giving a second thought about scanning the output to make sure that it doesn't exist somewhere else or they might be at risk for copyright infringement. What do you think about artists using these tools that are touted as creative bridges for them in their creative process?
I'm not opposed to it. I mean, I think collage, cut-ups, like taking text that exists in the world and jumbling and scrambling it in some poetic manner and rearranging it. There is like precedent in the historical avant-garde for this as like a legitimate form of writing. David Bowie used cut-ups his entire career. He had a piece of software built in the 90s called the Verbicizer that would just jumble up like newspaper articles, and he would use that to write song lyrics. Was he infringing on the people who wrote those articles? I mean, that's a nuanced conversation we can have, but I do see that as a valid form of writing. I think it's kind of boring to just, prompt a text model and get something out and just plonk it into a song without making any changes. I mean, that's no fun. It's much more fun to take all these fragments and put them together and try to impose meaning on them and try to think about what that arrangement means and play around with it. It's text and music is a sort of formal arrangement of elements. Ultimately, though, you still have to perform it and you still have to make it your own. And I think actually a lot of sort of human expression and human meaning exists like between the page and the expression, the physical expression. Like there's a lot that exists between what we say and how we say it. And especially when it comes to, musical performance, like the way you sing a song, there's a lot there. Like you can make a lot of choices, very, very nuanced choices to express a lot of different things, even from the same set of words. So I think meaning is very fluid in that way. And I don't necessarily only want to use generative writing tools, but I think they're a valuable part of the tool set. And there's an argument to be made for them being, a legitimate form of writing, kind of meta form of writing that can constitute original work.
I think that we want to, if our artists say, hey, we want to use these generative tools, we want to be able to offer them those tools. The issue for us right at this moment in time is that the available tools were trained on this unlicensed copyrighted content, right? So we've got an issue right now that hopefully will not extend into the future, right? When this gets solved and we have tools that were trained, if an artist can train it on their own past lyrics or artists can opt in and they're getting paid, then this problem kind of goes away.
Totally.
I think it's important too to make sure that we have the conversation, at least with the developers of the text generative AI models, to make sure that there are safeguards so that they're not actually straight reproducing things. Because what you wouldn't want is if you're using this as a tool and you're accidentally thinking that something came from an AI, but maybe it's, 7 words that are sufficiently original that somebody else already has copyright protection in, So I think, there's gonna be a lot to see how it plays out. But that's something to think about, just to cover your own bases, to make sure that you're not infringing on someone else's work, because we're not confident yet that the developers have these safeguards in place.
So artists need to have a seat at the table from the very beginning.
Absolutely. I think having a seat at the table, having licensing conversations, that means you get to have a say over how your stuff is used, and a business relationship with companies, and put the parameters on the uses that we want to see, rather than kind of retroactively trying to clean up the problem after they've already used everything.
Chris, I'd be curious, what are your thoughts on this? Does your company consult with artists about artificial intelligence, generative AI?
I think generative AI is relatively new, so I'm sure, given where I sit, I don't talk to a lot of artists directly. I'm sure that there are conversations going on all over the place. Internally, we're starting to give some guidance about how to view these things. And our perspective generally is artists and artistry. We're all about artists and artistry, and that comes from the top of the company on down. So when we're looking at these tools, we're very sensitive to how are they made, what are the implications for the people whose content was used. And I think that there is a desire to use them. We've already seen people do videos and artwork using the image generated AI, and some of them are pretty cool, but we're not at that stage where, thinking again of telling people, hey, don't use our stuff. Can we then turn around and use their stuff? We're not at a point where we feel like we can use those tools yet, but we want to get there.
Claire, going back to your perspective as an artist, at what point would you maybe not feel comfortable putting your name on a musical work that uses AI?
Well, I think when we set out to make our big AI record, the first mandate was that we wanted it to sound like us and not like software. And by that, I mean, we didn't want the tools that we used to dictate the shape of the work that we made, to dictate the shape or the sound of it. We wanted the tools to mix up the process, change the way we make music, our position in the process, but we still wanted to make the music because that's what we do. So I think for me as an artist, when I make things, I think of it as both a set of social relationships, me, my bandmates, my community, my scene, my audience, etc. Also as an experience that helps me think differently, or helps me grow, or expands my capacities, or my perspectives. And what comes out of that process is it's like a document of a process. It's a way to share that moment in my life with other people and maybe connect with them on shared elements of those experiences. I feel like I'm explaining the most basic aspects of music making, but I feel like I was able to do that with my AI assisted work, because although the AI was generating raw material, the output was not the end. And we still had to collage it all together, build structure, make production choices, arrange it, perform it. Basically, we had to make meaning out of all that chaos, which is what I always try to do. So I think I'm not comfortable putting my name on any work that doesn't meet that basic threshold of is this meaningful to me, and will it be meaningful to audiences? Otherwise, I don't really see why even bother, And I kind of refuse to accept in general the premise that music is a problem that can be solved. I think it can be a problem, but it's a good problem. It's hard. That's why it's valuable. And that's why it's so exciting when, your favorite artist comes out of the studio with something new, because they have a story to tell you. They went through something, and the music is a way to experience that vicariously. If there's no something to share, then, why bother?
Yeah, so long as you can see yourself in the output, right?
Yeah. And so long as the process of creating that output was something that you had to think about, that you had to make choices and take a few risks. I think that's really key.
Yeah, personally, I like using AI as a thought starter. I find that it can push me in directions that I would not have thought of on my own. It can give me prompts that I'm not musically comfortable with. And I view it no differently as when I get commissioned for a remix, for example, and stems are given to me, but I have to rearrange those and produce it into something that sounds completely different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So currently right now, Shannon, I would love to get a baseline definition from you on what can qualify for copyright. How much involvement does there have to be from a human? Can artificial intelligence qualify for copyright at all?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying I think that this is another one of those areas that's going to develop. But I mean, as far as where the line is. But right now, the basics are the US Copyright Act and the US Constitution only protect human authorship. So a purely AI generated work would not receive copyright protection. And that's the position the Copyright Office has taken. But you can get a copyright for creative expression in the form of selecting and arranging otherwise like not copyrightable elements. For example, if you take a classical music piece that was written in the 1500s, that's obviously no longer protected by copyright, but you select and arrange it in a new way, you could have a what's commonly referred to as a thin copyright in that selection and arrangement. They recognize that that's creativity and that's human expression, but you're obviously not getting a copyright in the original work. So that's, I think, how to think about it. There have been a couple of cases on this in the Copyright Office, or a couple of like people have tried to file to get copyright registrations for AI generated works. And they've said, obviously, purely AI generated works can't receive registration. So when someone filed a comic book and said, this was written by AI, the Copyright Office said, this is not, you can't actually have an AI as the author. But in that case, they found, okay, actually, it was the visual images in the comic book that were made by AI, but then there was an actual human author that did the selecting and arranging, and she wrote all of the text. And so where that came out is they're granting this copyright, but they're saying, you, the human, are the author. Only the pieces that you did are eligible for copyright protection. So that selection and arrangement of the images, that's copyrightable. The text that you wrote, that's copyrightable. But the images that were just generated by AI, that's not copyrightable. I think it's not totally clear. So in that case, like text and images, those are two really obviously distinct pieces, and you can separate them out really easily. I think where the line is on like a human AI collaborative thing, where some of the lyrics are coming from an AI and some of them are coming from you, and maybe you get a melody, but you're building on it. Where the line is there is not so clear. And it will be really interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, I would love to hear some more thoughts on this. Maybe, Chris, we could pull at the extremes for what exists right now and how messy it could get in the future as artists continue to use AI as a part of their process.
Yeah, the way that I explain this internally is kind of is that those two extremes. So on the one hand, you have the push button, make me a song, and there's no creativity at all. So that I think we can agree is not copyrightable. And I don't even think the other side thinks that's copyrightable. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you're using Logic Pro X, and you recorded your vocals and you record a guitar and you need drums. So you use the AI drummer, and then you mix and master and whatever. And that finished song has quite a bit of human creativity in it. So that song will be copyrightable. So in between, you have those two ends, and then somewhere in between there is a line, and the courts will over time figure out, where that is. If you were just to take that drum, that AI drum element by itself, that's probably not copyrightable, but it's all the other human creativity that goes around that makes that final product copyrightable.
Well, now that we know what it is that we are dealing with, for now, right? For now, let's talk a little bit about what we should be doing as an industry going forward. I would love to hear from all of you what you think would be good next steps for us as an industry or as creators, musicians, from your various sectors. What should we be thinking about and what should we actually be doing in this moment?
I'm happy to start. I think one of the things that, at least in the regulatory and policy space, we've seen movement on this concept of whether text and data mining should be allowed at a broad level, whether there's copyright protection in that or not. Different countries have taken different positions on it. The EU has a law to do with text and data mining. China has one, Singapore, Japan. The US doesn't. But the UK recently tried to put in they came out with a proposal that said broadly this should be allowed for all purposes. That's off the table now, but we're really early on, obviously, in this policymaking, but there is a lot, like that's sort of the first segment of policymaking that we're seeing is around this concept of text and data mining. And I think it's really important to be proactively involved because legislators, policymakers, they're hearing from the tech companies, they're hearing from the developers. They need to be hearing from the creators. We need to make sure that artists' rights and creators' rights are centered in these conversations very early on, because these conversations are already taking place, and it's the things that might seem technical, like text and data mining right now and aren't getting as much attention. Those will set the stage for how governments handle this and the kind of laws that protect us in the future. So I think it's really important to be involved and aware of what's going on and make sure that people know that we don't want companies to use our data and our works without licenses.
Yeah, completely, I agree. I think the artists need to be at the center of the conversation, and that we want to make sure that there's no erosion of artist rights as they exist today. So practically speaking, what does that translate into? For us, that means education. So educating, and Shannon does a lot of this, educating legislators and government officials in various departments on what our issues are, because some of them are thinking about how do we compete with other countries in AI. They're not thinking about how it affects, the existing industries or privacy or bias or other things like that. So educating governments, educating our peers. That's why we're doing this panel, trying to get other people in the community aware of this issue so that they're vocal. And if you're an individual, talk to your representative, talk to your label, talk to your publisher, talk to your trade organization, join the Copyright Alliance, make sure that your voice is heard. From our standpoint, think twice about using AI that was trained on someone's unlicensed copyrighted content. Maybe set up an AI review board internally to make sure that your own use of AI is ethical, and think about the long-term implications of what you're doing, so you don't accidentally stumble into giving away the ability to make content that sounds like you and you get nothing for it for the rest of time. That would be a bad outcome.
Yeah, I mean, agree with both of you. I think there's a tricky balance to strike between protecting artists from exploitation and allowing the space for artists to experiment with these new tools and invent something new with them that I think ultimately will allow us to kind of adapt and be creative and be resilient. But I think just being mindful of what data you're using, where it's coming from, which I think is best practices in general. Like, if you're bringing anything in, if you're bringing a new creative collaborator into your process, you want to know what their background is, right? It's the same kind of thing. You want to know what you're working with, and you want to have like a real clarity on that, I think, and sort of wrestle with any of the ethical implications. At the same time, I think artists, don't have an enormous amount of political or economic power for the time being, especially in our culture. But we do have cultural power. We do have the power to make things uncool. So my hope is that, as a culture, artists can band together and sort of create a sort of final stand against sort of exploitation that is imminent, and perhaps we can kind of influence the culture to realize that some of these tools aren't as magic and victimless as they seem.
I will add to that very long list of amazing ideas that artists on an individual level are always welcome to reach out to the Recording Academy. We do loads of advocacy throughout the year. AI is top of mind for us as an institution, and you can get involved with Grammys on the Hill if this is a concern for you, and we can help connect you with local politicians so you can actually meet folks face to face and actually tell them stories, which can be really powerful. Yeah. All right, so there's all sorts of things that we can do between the three of you. We got a great list of homework, so no one has any excuse. They can leave this and do something. And before we wrap things up, there's one thing that I want to touch on. Licensing has been brought up loads during this conversation as a potential solution, but are there risks to licensing?
I really don't think so. I think there's huge benefits to licensing. A license is just a contract, and contracts can be changed. They have terms. There are, the ability to negotiate between two parties for what you want, and if it's not working for you, you can change it. So I think it's really important to start licensing conversations now, because that will, if we can get licenses in place for AI training, that will set a precedent, and other companies will license, and we have like a huge opportunity to create partnerships that make value on both sides, and to do it on our terms. And I think that's what licensing is. And it's much easier to change a contract than it is to change a law, and it's much easier to write a contract than it is to file a lawsuit. So I think it's really important. I think that's the easiest, and not that it's easy to license, but I think that's the solution that will reduce controversy in the long run. I think we're going to get to a place with licensing anyway. If we look back at the digital streaming revolution, where did we end up? We ended up licensing. So either we can, as an industry, be in litigation for the next 10 years just to end up in the exact same place, or we can start licensing at the very beginning and make the system from the ground up in a way that's beneficial to everybody. So I think I'm pro-license.
I think that's right on. I agree with everything there. And part of our role is to help the AI companies understand that, there are artists whose content is being used, and they, in order to help them want to be involved and want to have their content be included as part of these training sets, we have to convince them why. And the why here is that they're going to make some money off of it, right? If worst case scenario, the AI's just wiped all the human music off the planet, that would be horrible. But if we could generate a new revenue stream here for artists, that they got paid when their name was used in a prompt, and when that trained content was uploaded to a streaming service, some of that incremental revenue went back to the people whose content was the most important in creating that output, and it was a meaningful revenue stream for them, it would be an entirely different conversation. So
yeah, it's really difficult to trust a company that uses your work without your consent. If there's even a conversation, I want to be asked, consent is really important. And knowing that, like the leap of faith it would take to consent to put my music onto any of these services voluntarily would require some exchange, some meaningful exchange, and that, some negotiation in good faith.
What are some other protections that we should be thinking about, especially for folks that maybe are not as close to the topic, and they might not understand what could be done or what guardrails could be put in place? For example, thinking about whether output should be labeled as AI generated, or should AI companies be obligated to track their training material and input output? What are some of those frameworks that feel reasonable to discuss in order to protect artists?
I think you're exactly right on record keeping. I think keeping track of the training data and what's in there, and what inputs were triggered or called upon in any given output that's generated, I think is absolutely essential. It has to be tracked. Otherwise, we don't know where things are coming from. I think that transparency is going to be really essential to whether some of these companies can be trusted or not. And I think that's, I think adequate record keeping and being very transparent about what's being used will, I mean, it's foundational if we're going to trust any AI developer.
Yeah, and I think that has a secondary benefit of if there is transparency around those data sets, then like the public, the consumers have an opportunity to learn about how machine learning works, you know? Because right now it's because it's closed off in this way, it does have the appearance of being kind of magical and neutral and victimless. But if you can actually see what's going on under the hood, I mean, it's kind of awe-inspiring to see how much sort of the sum total of human creativity is being run through these machines. Like it helps you to understand what's really going on under the hood, and I think by extension what's going on in all the AI tools that surround us every day, not just in music and image generated production. It's like an educational thing. I worry that these tech companies don't want us to understand what's going on, because then it comes with all these implications and responsibilities. They want us to believe that it's magic, but I think it's so much more interesting to see how messy it really is.
Yeah, agreed. I think we hit tracking. Labeling is something that we think probably should be done, because if you want users to be able to make a choice about the things they're listening to, they can't make that choice if they don't know what they're listening to, right? From a food standpoint, you can't choose to eat vegan if you don't know what's in your food. You have to know what's going in order to make that choice. And then there's other policy questions that we have to figure out about labeling. We touched on the infringement issue. So should AIs have to filter the input to make sure that people are not providing unlicensed content as input material? Should they have to filter the output so they're not unintentionally infringing existing works? There's a whole bunch of stuff here that we're gonna have to explore.
Yeah, and that a lot of that opacity also influences people to believe that the machine itself is what's being creative. People always ask me if a machine can be creative, and I think that's really the wrong question, because the more we ascribe agency to the machine itself, the more we absolve ourselves of any responsibility for the machine's impact on the world. But ultimately, like, the only reason that the output of any of these systems is interesting or beautiful or has value is because of the artists and musicians and writers whose vast data sets of production is what it's trained on. Like, everything AI knows about being creative, it's learned from us, and without us, it's nothing. So I'm always like, when people are talking about, the sentience of chatbots and stuff, I have to roll my eyes, because it's, I guess, easier to think about these entities and more romantic and more like sci-fi and future seeming to think of them as being creative in their own right. But that just devalues all the creativity that goes into making them what they are, which is a tale as old as time.
Well said. And I hate to make you come up with something equally as elegant and beautiful, but I am going to ask everyone to go around and think about, what is the one last thought that you would like people to take away from this conversation?
I guess I can start. So I think the number one issue for us here is that AI should not be trained on copyrighted works without permission. I think that's one of the themes of this whole conference. And that what we're trying to do is get people to talk to others in the industry, talk to your representatives, talk to your peers, because as one of my friends says, standard practice becomes accepted policy. And if we're silent, the standard practice is going to be ignoring copyright and just doing, letting the AI companies do whatever they want to do. So it's important for our voices to be heard. And most of the people on the other side that I've spoken to are reasonable. They're not thinking about it, and they haven't heard enough. So as we talk, we start to be able to swing the pendulum back the other way and make the artist the center of the conversation again. So that's where I would leave us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If I'm going to boil down everything into one takeaway, I think push for licensing. That's one takeaway. Two takeaways: be in touch with policymakers, be in touch with regulators, and be aware of what's going on, because we want to make sure that we're asking for our rights to be respected in the new technology from the very outset.
Yeah, I don't know. Music is not just data. Like, it's not notes on paper. It's a set of social relationships. It's documents of experience. It's what makes us human. I really don't want a generation of people to come of age thinking that music has no value, or that it's something that could just be bought and sold and traded like crypto coins or something. I think we can only avoid that scenario if we support artists' capacity to create culture and music on their own terms and protect them from the worst case scenarios.
Well said. I want to thank everyone for giving their time today, giving your thoughts, having such nuanced conversation around this tech that is increasingly becoming so commonplace for musicians and will continue to be more commonplace for every part of the music industry. Again, thank you to Chris, thank you to Claire, thank you to Shannon. This was a wonderful, enlightening conversation, and I hope everyone walks away having learned something new.
Thank you for hosting. It's been an honor to be on the panel with all of you brilliant people.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, invisible world.